The humid air of the Chang International Circuit doesn't just stick to your skin, it suffocates the machinery. In the high-stakes theater of MotoGP, silence is usually the sound of a job well done. But inside the Prima Pramac Yamaha garage following the Thailand Grand Prix, the silence was heavy, jagged, and filled with a growing sense of dread. On the surface, the weekend had looked like a standard case of a world-class rider struggling with the steep learning curve of a new prototype. The critics were already sharpening their pens, noting that Toprak Razgatlıoğlu, the man hailed as the savior of Yamaha's racing program, seemed uncharacteristically sluggish. He was missing his marks, losing ground on the straights, and failing to show that Stopie King spark that had defined his career. But as the sun set over Bararam, a different story began to emerge from the glowing blue screens of the telemetry engineers. While the fans in the grandstands were debating Toprak's adaptation to the V4 transition, a small group of mechanics stood huddled around a dismantled engine block in the back of the pit box. What they found wasn't a mistake in setup or a failure of the rider's will. It was something far more insidious. A mechanical betrayal that had been whispered about since the very first practice session. Behind the closed doors of the paddock, reports began to surface of a ghost inside the engine. A technical anomaly that shouldn't have been possible, yet it was systematically dismantling Toprak's chances of a podium before the lights had even gone out. The paddock had seen riders fight through injuries and bad tires, but fighting an invisible power loss is a psychological war that few can survive. This wasn't just a bad race. It was a revelation that would change everything the team thought they knew about their new engine's reliability. And from that moment, nothing would ever be the same for the Turkish star. Toprak Razgatlıoğlu didn't just enter MotoGP, he crashed into it like a tidal wave. For years, the narrative had been the same: he's too aggressive for a prototype, or superbike riders can't handle the carbon brakes. But when he signed with the Yamaha project, he carried the weight of an entire nation's expectations on his shoulders. He wasn't just racing for himself, he was racing to prove that the traditional path to the premier class was obsolete. The hype was stratospheric. Every move he made was scrutinized by the media, every practice lap analyzed for signs of the legendary Toprak style. In the early sessions in Thailand, the visual evidence suggested he was doing the impossible. He was breaking deeper into turn 1 than almost anyone on the grid, his rear wheel dancing inches off the asphalt as he forced the Yamaha into the apex. To the naked eye, he was a man possessed, but the stopwatch tells a story that the eyes often miss. Despite his heroics on the brakes, the gap to the leaders wasn't closing, it was widening. Inside the helmet, Toprak was sensing a disconnect. The bike felt heavy coming out of the corners. The snap, the violent thrust that usually followed his aggressive corner exits, had been replaced by a hollow drone. He was masking the bike's deficiencies with pure physical talent, using his body to hustle the machine through the technical sectors. But as the sessions progressed, the mask began to slip. The tension in the garage was palpable. Some insiders claimed the atmosphere was shifting from optimism to confusion. Why was the most talented rider in the world losing 0.3 of a second on a straightaway that should have been his playground? The pressure was building, not just from the outside, but from within a team that had gambled everything on this partnership. The first real sign of trouble surfaced during free practice 2. While the rest of the field was finding their rhythm, Toprak pulled into the pits with a look of quiet frustration. He didn't scream, he didn't throw his gloves. He simply pointed to the rear of the bike and spoke to his crew chief in hushed tones. He reported a strange sensation, a stutter in the power delivery that felt like the bike was gasping for air every time he cracked the throttle. Initially, the response from the Yamaha engineers was clinical. In the world of modern MotoGP, everything is blamed on electronics first. They assumed it was a mapping error, perhaps the traction control was being too intrusive, or the engine braking strategy was fighting the chassis. They spent hours poring over lines of code, adjusting the torque curves and swapping the gearbox ratios in an attempt to find the lost acceleration. But the deeper they dug into the software, the less sense the data made. The sensors said the throttle was open 100%, but the crankshaft wasn't responding with the calculated force. There was a growing rift beginning to form between the data and the rider's feel. The engineers saw minor fluctuations, but Toprak felt a void. It was a classic paddock dispute, the man versus the machine's ego. The team pushed forward, convinced that a simple electronic tweak would solve the issue for qualifying. Yet the real turning point happened away from the cameras, in a private meeting between the head of Yamaha's engine development and the Pramac management. The telemetry was starting to show something the software couldn't fix. It was a physical decline, a slow-motion heart attack happening inside the 4 cylinders of the M1. To understand why Toprak was struggling, you have to understand the brutal physics of a MotoGP straight. At 210 miles per hour, air becomes a solid wall. To punch through it, an engine needs every single horsepower it can muster. What the public didn't know, and what the team was desperate to keep under wraps, was that Toprak's engine was suffering from a catastrophic loss of combustion pressure. Internal reports later hinted at micro-damage to a cylinder lining, a flaw so small it was invisible to the naked eye, yet large enough to allow the precious explosive force of the fuel to leak away. Numerically, the loss was estimated at roughly 3% to 5% of total power. In any other vehicle, you wouldn't even notice it. But in a sport where the difference between pole position and 10th place is measured in milliseconds, a 3% loss is an eternity. It was the invisible thief. It stole his top speed, but more importantly, it stole his confidence. Toprak's entire riding style is built on trust that the bike will stop where he wants and launch when he demands. When the launch failed to materialize, his rhythm shattered. As he lined up against the likes of Marquez and Jorge Martin, the technical disparity became humiliating. On the backstraight of Bararam, the Ducati-powered bikes looked like they were in a different displacement class. They would pull 3, 4, 5 bike lengths on Toprak before they even reached the braking zone. He was fighting a war with a blunt sword. Rumors suggested deeper tension behind closed doors, as Yamaha representatives struggled to explain why their premier engine was failing its star rider on such a public stage. But what the Paddock discovered next shocked everyone. The race itself was a masterclass in professional suffering. From the moment the lights went out, Toprak was on the defensive. He managed to hold his position through the first few corners, utilizing his signature late braking to dive past Pedro Acosta in a move that looked like a desperate lunge. But as the laps ticked down, the mechanical decay accelerated. Every time he opened the throttle, the engine sounded flat. The aggressive corner exit that usually defined his performance was gone, replaced by a bike that seemed to be wading through deep water. The psychological pressure was immense. He could see Marquez and Martin pulling away with ease, their bikes stable and powerful, while he was forced to take massive risks just to stay within sight of their exhaust fumes. He was overbraking, asking the front tire to do things it wasn't designed for, simply to compensate for the engine's lethargy. It was a recipe for disaster. Paddock whispers started to circulate. Is he cracking under the pressure? Has the V4 broken him? Media critics, unaware of the internal sabotage happening inside the frame, began to question his stable race rhythm as a lack of ambition. But the truth was far more heroic. Toprak was managing a bike that was slowly dying underneath him. He was listening to the engine notes change, feeling the vibration of the failing component, and yet he refused to pull into the pits. He was dragging a wounded beast to the finish line, not for points, but for pride. However, the twist that followed would change the championship narrative entirely. When the race finally ended and the bikes were wheeled into Parc Fermé, the atmosphere in the Yamaha garage wasn't one of relief, it was one of investigation. As soon as the shutters came down, the engine was pulled. It wasn't until the engineers in Japan received the preliminary data that the true scale of the Thailand nightmare became clear. The micro-damage hadn't just affected the power, it had compromised the entire thermal management of the bike. Toprak had been racing on an engine that was essentially a ticking time bomb. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Pramac hierarchy. This wasn't a setup error. It was a fundamental reliability flaw that threatened the entire season's development. If one engine could fail this way, could they all? The narrative shifted instantly from Toprak is struggling to Toprak is lucky to be alive. The staggering realization was that he had finished the race at all. Analysts who studied the final sector data noted that by the final lap, Toprak was losing nearly 8 miles per hour on the straight compared to his teammate. The twist was that Toprak's disappointing result was actually one of the greatest rides of his career. He had maintained a stable pace on a machine that was losing its lifeblood with every revolution. The critics who had called him inconsistent were suddenly silenced. But while the technical mystery was solved, a larger shadow remained. Some mechanics claimed something felt off about the entire engine batch. Was this an isolated incident, or was the Yamaha V4 project fundamentally flawed from the start? In the weeks following Thailand, the Yamaha factory went into damage control mode. The engine was flown back to Iwata for a full forensic teardown. For Toprak, the incident left a scar that wasn't physical but professional. He had been promised a bike that could challenge the European manufacturers, but in his first real test, the machine had blinked first. The severe setback in Bararam wasn't just about the points lost. It was about the erosion of trust between a generational talent and a manufacturer in crisis. The team has officially stated that the issue was a one-off manufacturing defect, but the Paddock remains skeptical. In the high-pressure world of MotoGP, there are no coincidences. As the series moves toward the next round, the weight of expectation has only increased. The engine is fixed, the ghost has supposedly been exorcised, but the psychological toll on the rider remains a variable that no telemetry can measure. Toprak Razgatlıoğlu remains the Stopie King, the man who can make a motorcycle do things it was never intended to do. But Thailand proved that even the greatest magician cannot perform if his tools are broken. He wasn't just fighting his rivals that weekend, he was fighting the very heart of his machine. The question now isn't whether Toprak is fast enough for MotoGP, we know he is. The question is whether Yamaha can build a heart strong enough to keep up with him. What happened in the humidity of Thailand left even his closest team members stunned, but what happens next will determine the legacy of the most ambitious move in modern racing history. Yet, this was only the beginning of a far bigger storm.